Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something a little different today. Ever feel like you just put your foot in your mouth trying to be supportive?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Me too, and I bet our listeners can relate. So we're going to dissect those top 10 things you should never say, lists, the ones, figure out why they backfire, and most importantly, what we can actually say instead.
I love those lists, but they always leave me wanting more, Like,
Yeah.
what's the psychology behind these blunders, and what are some better alternatives?
Right, like we get that telling someone to just relax when they're anxious is unhelpful, but why? And what should we say instead? That's what we're going to unpack.
It all boils down to empathy, really. These lists are a goldmine for understanding where our good intentions can go wrong, especially when we try to apply generic solutions to very specific and nuanced situations.
Okay, I see that. Like assuming everyone grieves the same way or that a pep talk is the answer to unemployment. But isn't there some value in trying to offer solutions even if they're not perfect? I mean, it's coming from a good place, right?
Absolutely, the intention is important.
Hmm.
But sometimes those solutions, even well-intentioned ones, invalidate the other person's experience. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, totally. I'm starting to see that.
Let's take new parents, for instance.
Hmm.
Our sources highlight how often they hear things like, sleep when the baby sleeps. On the surface, practical, right?
Sure, makes sense. Get your rest when you can.
But if you dig a little deeper, it minimizes the very real challenges. The sleep deprivation, the hormonal shifts, the constant demands of a newborn. It's not always that simple.
It's like telling someone with anxiety to just relax doesn't really address the complexity of what they're going through.
Exactly. It's dismissive. And it can leave new parents feeling like they're failing if they can't just sleep when the baby sleeps.
Oof, I can see how that would add to the stress.
Research actually backs this up, this kind of unsolicited advice. It can increase stress and anxiety in new parents.
So instead of those quick fixes, what's a better approach?
Think about what new parents really need, you know, validation, support, practical help.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So instead of saying, you look tired, which, let's be honest, can feel like a criticism.
Yeah, no one wants to hear that.
Right. Try something like, it sounds like you're juggling a lot. Is there anything I can do to help?
Ooh, that's so much better. You're acknowledging their challenges without judgment and offering genuine support.
And instead of, are you getting any sleep? Which can feel kind of accusatory.
Yeah, does it put people on the spot?
Try, how are you holding up? Parenthood can be overwhelming. Opens the door for them to share their struggles if they choose to.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, how does this apply to other sensitive situations? Like supporting someone who's grieving?
This is where understanding the nuances of grief is critical. We often reach for platitudes, they're in a better place, or everything happens for a reason. But these seemingly comforting phrases, they can actually be quite harmful.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, aren't those statements meant to offer comfort and hope?
The problem is they try to impose a sense of order or meaning onto a situation that often feels chaotic and senseless, and that can backfire.
So telling someone who is grieving that their loved one is in a better place might make them feel like they shouldn't be sad or that their grief is somehow wrong.
Precisely. It dismisses their very real pain. And everything happens for a reason. Makes it sound like they're being blamed for their loss, like they should just accept it without question.
Wow, I never thought about it that way.
And studies have actually shown these types of statements can actually prolong the grieving process by preventing individuals from fully processing their emotions.
So what can we say instead? What actually helps?
Honestly, focus on simply being present and acknowledging their pain. Something like, I'm so sorry for your loss. I can't imagine what you're going through. That can be much more comforting than trying to offer explanations or solutions.
That makes sense. It's about validating their feelings and letting them know that you're there for them without trying to fix or minimize their grief.
Right. And it's also important to remember that grief isn't linear. There's no timeline for healing. Everyone grieves in their own way. So avoid things like, you should be feeling better by now, or time heals all wounds.
Yeah, those statements just add pressure and can make someone feel like they're not grieving correctly, whatever that even means.
Exactly. Instead, try, I'm here for you no matter what you're feeling or how long it takes. It offers unconditional support without judgment.
Okay, that's really helpful. So we've covered new parents, Grief. What about conversations around mental health? That's a topic that often comes with a lot of stigma and misunderstanding.
Absolutely. And this is where validating feelings and avoiding dismissive language is particularly crucial.
Because unlike a physical injury, mental health challenges aren't always visible, so it can be easier for people to dismiss or minimize them.
Exactly. Phrases like, just snap out of it, or it's all in your head. So damaging.
Yeah, I can see why. It's like you're saying it's not a real struggle.
Right. Reinforces the misconception that mental health is a matter of willpower or a sign of weakness.
You know, one thing I've heard a lot, and I'll admit, even said myself in the past, is you have so much to be grateful for. On the surface, it seems positive, but now I'm realizing how that could be dismissive.
It is. Classic example of what psychologists call toxic positivity. Gratitude's great, don't get me wrong, powerful tool, but not a cure-all for mental health conditions. Telling someone to just focus on the positive makes them feel like their struggles aren't valid.
It's like saying their pain doesn't matter because other people have it worse. So what's a better approach? What can we say to show support without minimizing their experience?
Instead of trying to cheer them up or offer solutions, try, I'm here for you. It sounds like you're going through a really tough time. Just acknowledging their pain, offering a listening ear. Incredibly powerful.
And if someone is open to talking more about their mental health, we can offer support by helping them find resources or connect with a mental health professional.
Exactly. It's not our job to diagnose or treat, but we can help them access the help they need.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit here. New parents, grief, mental health. Ready to tackle another potentially tricky topic.
Absolutely, hit me with it.
Let's dive into a subject that can be especially sensitive. Unemployment, losing a job, major life event often comes with a lot of emotional baggage.
And unfortunately, people often see things that, while perhaps well-intentioned, can actually make the situation worse.
Like what? What are some of the common pitfalls in these conversations?
One of the biggest mistakes is offering unsolicited advice or making judgments about someone's job search process. Phrases like, just get a job, or why don't you try applying it, and insert random company here, can be incredibly frustrating and hurtful.
I can see how those statements would feel dismissive. It's like you're minimizing the complexity of the job market and the emotional toll of unemployment.
Exactly. And it implies that the person isn't already trying their best, or that finding a job is simply a matter of effort.
And I imagine questions like, what do you do all day? Or are you any closer to finding something? Can also add pressure and make someone feel like they're being judged or interrogated.
Right. Those types of questions can make someone feel like they have to justify their every move or that their worth is tied to their employment status.
So instead of offering advice or asking those kinds of questions, what's a more supportive approach?
Focus on acknowledging their challenges and offering genuine support. You could say something like, job searching can be so stressful. How are you holding up? Or is there anything I could do to help with your search?
Those statements feel much more empathetic and supportive. You're recognizing their struggles without judgment and offering assistance without being pushy or overbearing.
Exactly. And if you happen to have any relevant connections or resources, you can offer to share them. But avoid making it sound like you have all the answers or that it's a simple solution.
Right. It's about being a source of support, not a source of pressure or unsolicited advice.
Now, are you ready to tackle one of the most nuanced and potentially challenging areas of conversation?
I think so. Bring it on.
Let's talk about how to navigate conversations about race and ethnicity with sensitivity and respect.
Okay, this is a topic where it feels especially important to choose our words carefully. I'm ready to dive in. What are some of the common phrases we should avoid in these conversations, and why are they problematic?
This is a topic that's so important to get right, because even with the best intentions, it's so easy to stumble into territory that perpetuates stereotypes or makes others feel othered.
Totally. I've definitely been in situations where I've heard things or even said things myself that I later realized were insensitive or offensive, even though that was never my intent.
It happens, and it just highlights why it's so crucial to be mindful of the language we use, One of the most frequent and cringeworthy examples our sources point out is the phrase, "You're so exotic."
Ooh, yeah, I've heard that one a lot, and it always makes me feel uncomfortable, but I could never quite put my finger on what's actually wrong with calling someone exotic.
Well, on the surface, it might seem like a compliment, but it actually objectifies and otherizes the person. It reduces their entire identity to their appearance or perceived difference from the speaker, often based on race or ethnicity.
So it's like you're saying they're interesting or attractive because they're different from what's considered normal or mainstream.
Exactly. And that can make the person feel like they're being viewed as a novelty or a specimen rather than an individual.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like you're saying their worth is tied to how much they deviate from the dominant culture standards of beauty or normalcy.
Right. And it reinforces the idea that certain cultures or ethnicities are more exotic or interesting than others, which contributes to a hierarchy of cultural value.
Another phrase I've heard, and I'm embarrassed to admit I even use myself, is where are you really from? Why is that problematic? Isn't it just a way of showing interest in someone's background?
The issue is that it implies that the person doesn't belong, that they're not truly from the place they call home. It often stems from the assumption that someone who looks or sounds different must be from somewhere else.
So it's like you're saying their identity is being questioned or invalidated based on their appearance.
Exactly. It sends the message that they're not fully accepted or seen as legitimate members of their community. And it can be particularly hurtful for people who have always lived in a certain place, but are constantly made to feel like outsiders because of their race or ethnicity.
It's like you're constantly being asked to prove your belonging, even though you have every right to be there.
And this ties into the broader issue of microaggressions, which are subtle but pervasive forms of discrimination that can have a significant cumulative impact on individuals' well-being.
So these seemingly small comments can actually contribute to a larger system of inequality and oppression.
Exactly. And it's why it's so important to be aware of the potential impact of our words, even if we don't intend to cause harm.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the phrases to avoid. What are some better ways to approach conversations about race and ethnicity?
First and foremost, approach these conversations with humility and a willingness to learn. Recognize that you may not have all the answers, and that it's okay to ask questions respectfully if you're genuinely trying to understand someone's perspective.
So instead of assuming we know someone's background or experiences, we should be open to hearing their stories and perspectives.
Exactly. And avoid making generalizations or assumptions about entire groups of people. Remember that everyone is an individual, and their race or ethnicity is just one aspect of their identity.
That's a really important point. We should be treating everyone as individuals, not as representatives of their race or ethnicity.
And if you're unsure about something, don't be afraid to ask for clarification. For example, you could say, "I've heard this term used, but I'm not sure if it's appropriate. Could you explain it to me?"
That shows that you're willing to learn and that you respect their knowledge and expertise.
And finally, remember that conversations about race and ethnicity can be complex and sensitive. Be mindful of the other person's comfort level and avoid pushing them to share more than they're willing to.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about respecting their boundaries and recognizing that these conversations can be emotionally charged. So we've covered a lot of ground today, from new parents to grief to mental health to unemployment and now race and ethnicity. What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener will walk away with from this deep dive?
One of the most important things to remember is that the goal of these conversations is not to fix or solve, but to connect, empathize, and support.
So it's more about listening and validating than offering advice or solutions.
Exactly. And it's about being mindful of the impact our words can have, even if we don't intend to cause harm.
Because sometimes our attempts to help or relate can actually make things worse if we're not careful.
And another key takeaway is that it's okay to make mistakes. We're all learning and growing, and we're bound to say the wrong thing from time to time.
So we shouldn't be afraid to apologize if we realize we've said something insensitive or offensive.
Exactly. And we can use those mistakes as opportunities to learn and do better next time.
That's a really empowering message. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to grow and learn from our missteps.
Now, as we move into the final part of this deep dive, I'd love to hear from our listener. What are some of the things that have resonated with you so far? Are there any particular phrases you're going to try to avoid or any new approaches you're excited to implement in your own conversations?
We'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections. You know, as we wrap up this exploration of sensitive conversations, what's really sticking with me is how much power our words hold. You know, we can uplift and support, or we can unintentionally wound and alienate.
And what I find fascinating is that often the most helpful responses are the simplest ones. Instead of reaching for a solution or an explanation, sometimes the best thing we can offer is just genuine presence.
Right. Like thinking back to the examples we talked about around grief. You know, instead
Yeah.
of trying to find that perfect thing to say, sometimes just acknowledging, I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm here for you. That can be so powerful.
It really is. It's about recognizing that we don't have to have all the answers, and that simply being there for someone can be more valuable than any advice or platitude we could offer.
So much wisdom in that. So let's do a quick recap for our listener. We covered a lot of ground, but what are some of those core principles to keep in mind when navigating these potentially tricky conversations?
Well, the first principle that comes to mind is empathy. Really putting ourselves in the other person's shoes, trying to understand their experience can really help us move towards more compassionate and supportive responses.
And remembering, as we've been saying, that everyone's experience is unique, what might be helpful for one person could be totally off base for another.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which brings us to our second principle. Avoid judgment. Resist the urge to offer unsolicited advice or make assumptions about someone's situation.
It's about meeting people where they are rather than trying to force them into a box that fits our own expectations or experiences.
Exactly. And this ties into the third principle, respect. Treat everyone with dignity and kindness, regardless of their background, beliefs, or experiences.
It sounds so simple, but it's amazing how often we forget this basic principle, especially when we're caught off guard or feeling uncomfortable.
It really is. And finally, perhaps the most powerful tool we have in these conversations is listening. Truly listen without interrupting or, formulating our response while the other person is still speaking.
Because sometimes the most supportive thing we can do is just create that space for someone to share their story and to feel heard. Now, I'd love to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question to ponder. What's one small change you can make in your communication today to be more empathetic and supportive?
Maybe it's consciously avoiding those never say phrases we discussed, or making an effort to ask more open-ended questions and truly listen to the responses.
Or maybe it's just taking a pause before you speak to consider the impact of your words.
Whatever it is, remember that even small changes can make a big difference in creating more compassionate and meaningful connections.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's equipped you to navigate those tricky conversations with more confidence, empathy, and grace. Until next time, keep those conversations flowing with kindness and curiosity.